Welcome to episode 21 of our reflections on the Psalms, and today we're going to look at Psalm 20. And it's very likely that some have suggested this psalm was probably a prayer, a kind of collective prayer that reflects the congregational side as much as the personal side of David, prayed just before or ahead of a critical battle. It's not certain, but some of the language would assume that that is what's going on here. And if you look at the psalm together, the first 5 verses, you kind of get an idea. It's a congregational response to God, and that's picked up in that little word "we" in verse 5 of Psalm 20. And then the latter verses from 6 to 9, that's kind of more reflective of David's heart going into this. And I think as you look at it, sometimes they say that when you face a critical moment in your life or a real tough place, what comes through is your most fundamental priorities. People close ranks in tough times, or they get more family minded, or they go away from, it's not about the golf club anymore, it's about my health. It's not about pursuing this or making that extra bonus or getting that kind of promotion, but it's more about my family, my life, my health, my perspective. And I think tough times does that. It kind of narrows the focus and clarifies us somewhat. And there's a little bit of that going on in this psalm as you think about that if this is written just prior to a key battle, it has a way of fine-tuning the thoughts and the priorities. And so what you find in the first sort of 5 verses is more a communal prayer and response to God. So let's read them together. Psalm 20 in verses 1 to 5 says this: "May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. May he remember all your offerings and regard with favor your burnt offerings, Selah. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your plans. May he shout for joy over your salvation, and in the name of our God set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions." You can tell a lot about a people's or a culture's perception of God through the way they pray. You ever notice that? Prayer it's a bit of a revealer. The way you pray says a great deal about the type of God you're praying to. The language you adopt tells you something about the perception of God that you carry. And I think it's quite incredible that as you read these opening verses, this is what you see. What seeps out as you say and you read these things is what we imagine God to be like. For example, if you look again at these first 5 verses, are these the kinds of prayers? Are these the kinds of words that a people would use if they believed in a dictatorial or manipulative or a detached God, a cruel God, if you like? What comes through as you read through these verses is something very different, isn't it? They are convinced of a God who engages, who interpositions, who intervenes, who gets alongside, who supports, who brings salvation, which is kind of deliverance, rescue, justice. They believe in a God who is on their side. Look at the wording that it has. The confidence that comes through in these verses. In verse 1 it says that God will answer, that God will protect. In verse 2 that he will help, that he will support. In verse 3 that he will remember, that he will favor. In verse 4 that he will grant, that he will fulfill. Why are these prayers so significant? Because what they are really doing, these Israelites, they're saying this: God, just be who you are. Because that's who they believed God was, an engaging and a helping and a supporting and a delivering and a favoring God, God who would come alongside them and uplift them and support them. And what's interesting, of course, is from another perspective, is you could say, well, why the need for such a prayer? And the way we think about that is because we often think that we conduct our relationship with God in such a way at times that any kind of affliction or problem or difficulty is almost seen as an infringement on that relationship. Like, God, you're a good father, and a good father wouldn't let any of his children fall into trouble or into hassle or get upset. So if we ever do get upset and fall into trouble, there's a lacking somewhere. There's a communication breakdown. There's something's not quite right. But of course, you see, what you find is this. I don't think that there was a single iota of surprise in a single one of these Jews that once again they found themselves pursued by an enemy, facing a battle, under incredible kind of tension and chaos, facing wreck and ruin. Not a single one of them would have been surprised that yet again they find themselves in this position. It is part of life. It's what often happens. But what they know is that as much as God is a God of war and power, and you see that image of God reflected many times, not just in the Psalms, but throughout the Old Testament. But he's also a God of sustenance. He's a God of mercy. He's a God of gentleness. And so in their heart, there is this huge confidence that as they pray, they are praying to a God who is these things. They're not trying to persuade a cruel and detached and a kind of, aloof deity to just maybe change his character slightly and just be a good guy for once. What they're actually doing is they're saying, God, you are good. You are protector. You are the deliverer. You are a God of justice. So just be who you are on our behalf. And it's a fabulous insight into the confidence they had of God. And then, of course, what follows that is David's response. And you find that again in these four short verses. Now, David prays these prayers. Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. Verse 6. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving might of his right hand. You see, can you see the confidence David exudes? It's kind of as the people pray and express that confidence, David responds with an equal sense of confidence in God. Verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. O Lord, save the King. May he answer us when we call. And so just as much as we saw in verse 5, just as much as prayer, in those first 5 verses rather, just as much as prayer reflects a culture or a people's perception of God, so in the same way, what we put trust in, what we have confidence in, reflects our understanding of life and progress in that life and the good life. I don't have to tell you that as you look at this psalm, there is a lot of parallel thinking along the lines of the verse we read together in verse 7. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. David's drawing a contrast here between what he sees as the enemy, who believes that because of their great amount of chariots and because of their innumerable army and because of their artillery and whatever else they've got, they are confident of victory. And David looks at that and he says, some people trust in that, but I'm trusting in God. I believe that against the odds, at times he faced many battles with that kind of thinking and dynamic going on. Even against the odds, David says, God will come through. And sometimes there's, if we take another angle of this, sometimes it's very kind of a difficult place, isn't it? When we look at other people who happen to have all the chariots and the artillery and seem to have way more than we have. They have the better house, they have a nicer job, they have more prospects, they seem to have a more secure future. And sometimes it can make us think, maybe that's how I should have lived my life. Maybe them are the choices I should have made. Maybe I would have been happier. Maybe I would have been more secure. Maybe I wouldn't have found things as difficult. And there's a way of thinking that says or seems to suggest that what they've done is really what I should have put more confidence in. But this is where David takes a step back. And oftentimes in life, you've got to do this, haven't you? You look at a situation, you realize that there's so many things that probably would come under that bracket of could have, should have, might have. Things we wish we'd have done differently. And sometimes we stand back and we think, I may not have had the success in that area, or I may not have had the confidence of that person, or I may not have kind of amassed myself that amount of well-being or money or whatever it is. But I know that as I trust in God, everything will turn out fine. And I think this is what's going on with David. See, some people, they trust in money being the issue to the good life. And I've sat with people who've eulogized over their latest business ventures, or they've kind of waxed lyrical about all the various avenues in which they've invested money and it's paid for them, hand over fist, paid massive dividends back. And it's almost like their definition of this is what the good life's all about. And of course, if you are not one of them people who've made that kind of success on money, you can start to feel a bit inferior that perhaps you've not made more of your life than you should have done in that area. And then I've had people speak about the fact that, whatever you do in life, it really doesn't matter as long as you look after your own, look after your family. And to them, to define the fulfilling life is nothing other than looking after yourself, your husband or wife, and your family. And if you can do that, you're a good person. And I can't tell you how many funerals I have done where that has basically been the definer of a good man or a good woman. They oftentimes, they say, they looked after their family and they treated us well. And it was almost like, ultimately, that's what the rich life is all about. And of course, there's a lot of truth in that, but it doesn't stop there. And then there are some people who would assume that life is about just the enjoyment of life, seeing the world, having adventures, having experiences. And they say, well, the richer you have. And I've talked to people who've traveled the world and they're only half my age. And of course, there's a little bit of you that thinks, maybe I needed to have got out more and not been so stuck in my ways and just got out there and sinned more. And you have all these conflicting thoughts about what living the good life, the fulfilling life, if you like, the well-lived life looks like. And I think maybe a little bit of this is David saying, some trust in chariots and some trust in horses. Some have more than I do. Some have a richer element of life than I've ever had. What he does is he draws it back to what really matters. He takes that huge step back. And don't you have to do that sometimes in life? You see all that's going on and it's not bad, but it does sometimes set that message to you that you could have if you'd have tried harder, or you could have done this if you'd have made different choices. And ultimately it starts to mess with your perspective of what's important and what's a priority in life. And as you step back, you realize that God has brought so much into my life, and I'm sure into yours, of far greater value than all the things that surround us and outside. And I think David's doing a little bit of that. He's taking a step back. And if this psalm, as we think, is reflections of David and the people of God prior to a battle, then of course he uses very military terms in horses and chariots and things like that. But he's also understanding that God is a God of incredible power, incredible might. And so, although there are those who trust in what they see and what they can handle and what they can ride in this case, or fire in that case, because it's a very military setting, David's trust lies in a very different dimension. His trust isn't wrapped up simply in what he sees and what he touches and what he can smell, the immediate, the sensational now. David's trust is in a very different place, whether he can see it or not, whether he knows it or not, whether he can feel it or not, whether he feels secure, whether he feels lost, or whether he feels kind of he possesses everything or he lacks everything, whether he feels he's very certain or he's riding on that edge of uncertainty. He knows that despite these vulnerabilities and these uncertainties that, let's face it, every single one of us carry, the lack that he has is made up in the completeness and the fullness of God. David is assured that ultimately this isn't about how much strength he's managed to acquire, how much intelligence he carries, how much resource he possesses or support that he can draw on. David is assured that ultimately God is his majority. God is all that he needs, that everything that he lacks can be found in the all-powerful, all-knowing, fully able, fully supportive God that he follows. And I think for a lot of us, there is a huge sense of confidence we can draw from this. Listen, it really doesn't matter what particular faith you speak of having or not having, whether you're a rampant atheist, whether you're an agnostic, whether you're someone who believes in all sorts of stuff. Ultimately, we all trust something. There's no such thing as a truly independent person. We lean on lots of stuff in life. There are lots of things that we trust in that we can't control. Let me go right to the basics. You and I cannot control our health. We can do the things we're supposed to do. We eat healthy, we exercise, all those things. But ultimately, you don't control and I don't control my health. None of us are immune to being suddenly hit by an illness. A couple of years ago, I found myself in hospital battling for my life with real serious respiratory problems. Up to that point, I was running like over 200 kilometers every month. I'd never been so healthy in all my life. I hadn't been ill for years. And then suddenly there I was in a hospital bed, my wife being told they weren't sure that whether I would pull through or not. How does that work? It works because none of us have control of our health. And there's an ultimate area where we have to trust in something beyond ourselves. Now, you don't have to be religious to know that you are trusting in something. The big question is, how reliable is that thing or that person or that situation that you're trusting in? David said, there are some who put all their trust in the chariots and the horses. In other words, their own resource, what they see, what they can touch, the things that they can physically get a hold of. But David says, but I will trust in the name of the Lord my God. That is something phenomenally intangible, isn't it? You can't pick God up. You can't put him in a frame. You can't stick him in a bank account. This is something that's beyond that. And David's confidence is that ultimately he will stand. You see what he says in verse 8? They collapse and fall. David is aware, because let's face it, he's a man who's had horses and chariots. David says those things ultimately collapse and fall. Your health ultimately, sadly, will collapse and fall. Your bank account, however glorious it looks at the moment, ultimately will collapse and fall. That job, that position you hold, the group of people you spend all your time with, partying, whatever, all the things that you would say, this is what life's all about. Well, all them things fade in time. As good as they are and as fun as they are, they fade. But David says those things collapse and fall, but he says, we rise and stand upright. Because as you get older, the things around you do fade, but God never does. What you have in God is an evergreen. It is constantly giving. God is constantly reinforcing. And ultimately, when our life is finally to its end, it is then that we embrace an even more glorious element of God and the future. And so this is kind of taking us on a trajectory that is going better and better and better the older we get. And that's the glorious truth, the glorious confidence David and these Israelites are reflecting in this psalm. So yes, there are people who've made it better than you, who seem to be enjoying life better than you, doing more, seeing more, visiting more, flying to more places, seeing more spots of the world. There's probably 100 things you would be envious about. But just take a step back. Some do trust in horses and chariots. David says, my trust is in God. And of course, when you realize where your trust is, that says a lot and determines a lot about the nature of the way you live life, doesn't it? And that's what this psalm we've just read together is really reflecting on. What we trust determines how we will live. I think there's a big message there as you look through this psalm. And let me encourage you. If you're in that place at the moment, just feel, what is my life all about? And why haven't I done what they've done and lived in the house they're living with and seen the kind of friends they've seen and been to the places they've been? All that stuff that messes with your head at times. Take a step back. Do a David. Some trust in those things, but I trust in God. And I know that ultimately the greatest fulfillment of life will come my way. And I'm sure as you do that, God will bless you. And you'll sense something of that wonderful inner peace that is, to be honest, beyond how words can define it. God bless you.